La Fontaine is one of the rare authors today that everyone still knows almost completely by heart. Everyone knows at least one fable. Everyone knows the music of a fable.
One day went strutting on the river's banks the long-necked heron, long beak and spindle shanks.
We can rediscover La Fontaine's fables, sometimes remembering verses we learned as children, and suddenly realize how much incredible poetic charm they possess. And that is what makes La Fontaine's power so great.
Par exemple, dans La Poule aux œufs d'or, il va dire l'avarice perd tout en voulant tout gagner. Je ne veux pour en témoigner que celui dont la poule, à ce que dit la fable, pondait tous les jours un œuf d'or. Ben vous voyez ça, il y a un mystère. Pondait tous les jours un œuf d'or, tu le vois. Faut essayer de montrer au public un lingot de 500 grammes, de 200 grammes. C'est énorme. L'once qui descend, boum, elle pond de l'or. Le mec devient fou. Tous les jours, il a 100 grammes d'or. Il serait intelligent, il en resterait là. Mais il dit, il crut que dans son corps, elle avait un trésor. Et il crut que dans son corps, elle avait un trésor. C'est parfait. Il crut que dans son corps, elle avait un trésor. Il la tua, l'ouvrit, et la trouva semblable à celle dont les œufs ne lui rapportaient rien, s'étant lui-même ôté le plus beau de son bien. Belle leçon pour les gens chiches. Merveilleux le mot, chiche. Belle leçon pour les gens chiches. Pendant ces derniers temps, combien en a-t-on vu qui du soir au matin sont pauvres devenus pour vouloir trop tôt être riches.
This stroke of genius in the Fables is that of a mature man. When the very first collection appeared in March 1668, Jean de La Fontaine was nearly 47 and had several literary attempts behind him.
He's a man who, without a doubt, has a certain charisma, but he is not conventionally handsome.
A man quite a solid, strong figure with a nose very distinctly bourbon-like.
A slightly glazed and dreamy eye, a gaze that seems to drift off into the distance, with a mouth of such great refinement that it seems made to launch sharp witticisms, or to spread the very music of language.
He's quite a curious personality and at the same time very endearing because of the easygoing nonchalance that he exudes. He is, without a doubt, a true man of dreams.
What they called a dreamer in those days was an eccentric. He's someone who's a little bit out of step, not quite grounded. He's a peculiar kind of person. He's a poet who makes people dream, by virtue of his unique ability to do what no one else would. That is, to truly see what others simply don't perceive.
It's precisely thanks to this fresh perspective that La Fontaine creates a work that will delight his contemporaries.
The Fables, yes, but it's a thunderclap. It's a thunderclap like Molière's plays, like Racine's. It's immense, truly immense. All people and all ages. That's what's so remarkable. Everyone is involved. Men, women, the tall, the small, the old, the young. Everyone is there, that is to say, it unites them.
Nevertheless, La Fontaine's gamble was, to say the least, quite audacious.
It's important to know that these fables, he didn't invent them. At least, the subject of the fables.
It's an extremely ancient genre that we trace back to the legendary figure of Aesop, this Phrygian fabulist, lame, deformed, but who, through his words, managed to win the ear of kings.
Like many authors from antiquity, we don't know if it's a single person or if it's a tradition of aggregated elements. In any case, it's a type of corpus that was eventually recorded in writing.
And under the name of Aesop, we group together everything that resembles fables, and which we intuitively consider as an illustrative narrative, generally featuring animals from which to draw a moral.
Fables at that time were seen as something essentially tedious.
It's a genre that we practice to train in the handling of language. So, you're given a narrative and you must extract the moral from it. You're given a moral and you must invent a story that will illustrate it. So, La Fontaine considers that since everyone knows the stories of the crow and the fox and the cicada and the ant, his talent is to transform them through a stylistic treatment that will give them a completely new significance.
And La Fontaine, from this academic genre, creates a true masterpiece.
The Bibliothèque Nationale carefully preserves valuable editions of both Aesop's fables and those by La Fontaine. The direct comparison of these two distinct versions, separated by a span of 20 centuries, is quite revealing. What you will find here is a French translation of Aesop's fables.
If we read the fable of the fox and the crow, this is what it says. The fox, seeing the crow perched upon a tree, who had in its beak a cheese it had just stolen, approached him and began to praise his beautiful plumage. If we compare it with the beginning of La Fontaine's fable, which everyone knows, perched on a lofty oak, Sir Raven held a lunch of cheese, Sir Fox, who smelt it in the breeze. Thus to the holder spoke, "Ha, how do you do, Sir Raven? Well, your coat, sir, is a brave one, so black and glossy, on my word, sir. With voice to match, you were a bird, sir." And so on and so on. With La Fontaine, we're truly in a small theater, a scene between two characters. With Aesop, it's almost a description of the image we see. There's no action, it's a really boring description.
Quand on plonge dans Ésope, mais ça pèse 4 tonnes. Donc il y a un moment, quelque chose s'est passé, un être exceptionnel s'est accaparé et a adapté, en rendant encore plus extraordinaire ce matériau de la sagesse antique, ce matériau du bon sens, ce matériau de toutes ces morales.
La Fontaine's greatest talent is how he inhabits the language, as no one has done before or after him. When he says, "A dove came to a brook to drink, when leaning o'er its crumbling brink, an ant fell in," and never has the verb to fall fallen so perfectly into place.
The absolute marvel of La Fontaine is that he, along with Jean Racine, occupies one extreme of the French language, precision and conciseness, and at the other extreme, there is Proust. That is to say, on one side, there are 3 words, on the other, there are 3 pages.
Over the course of 25 years, La Fontaine wrote nearly 250 fables. The most popular ones often feature animals. The poet populated the 17th century with talking creatures, bringing to life an enchanted bestiary.
La Fontaine's animals, they are at once endearing because they resemble us, but they are also very unsettling precisely because they resemble us. They are, I would say, the embodiment of all of mankind's imperfections. And when one lists all of these fables, one can fully reconstruct the whole of mankind. Among the animals most clearly defined in fables, we find the fox. It is he who, in various narratives, presents the many different facets of human intelligence, starting with the seductive power of speech. The fox is a truly eloquent speaker. This fox, who is a deceiver, obviously needs a victim, and animals often appear in pairs in fables. The fox, he deceives. And who does he deceive? Always the wolf. The wolf appears as the character who is both formidable and yet a bit foolish. We can laugh at him. The lion symbolizes power, and like all monarchs, they fall victim to the hypocrisy of their courtiers. This immense power, which is simultaneously a victim of its own weakness, is one of the profound moral lessons found in fables. Thus, we often see the lion become a victim of something far smaller than itself, a tiny gnat. The lion finds itself indebted to a completely insignificant species, the rat. It's a way of telling those in power, beware, your downfall is always imminent when you reach the very top.
But La Fontaine is not an anarchist, of course, but there is a social critique that emerges from behind these fables. He can advance, masked through this menagerie, to criticize the court, to criticize the behavior of flatterers, the ambitious of those who only seek to flatter the king, even though he himself, of course, also seeks to flatter the king. He is part of the human herd.
La Fontaine does not judge. He knows very well that we are afraid of death. He knows very well that we are unhappy in love. He knows very well that we are courtiers. But he says, I am like that too. I am like you. He is our brother, our elder brother. He is not a judge.
Seduced by this tone, at once lucid and benevolent, the Grand Siècle's public kept asking for more. La Fontaine would therefore never stop writing fables, neither a rebel nor a revolutionary, but, as he was his entire life, a free man. It was at the gates of Champagne, on the banks of a Marne meander, that Jean de La Fontaine was born in 1621. The eldest son of a prominent Château-Thierry family, he grew up in one of the town's finest homes.
We're in a beautiful French-style private mansion. That means the main building is at the back of the courtyard where the owners reside, and on either side there are L-shaped wings, like the one behind me, with the communal areas. This is one of the few houses in Château-Thierry that boasts a cut stone facade in a region where homes are typically built with stucco and plaster. So this is truly the beautiful house Jean de La Fontaine's father purchased as his bourgeois family was on its way to aristocracy. We are here in the Great Hall of the house, the largest room of the house, which in the 17th century still has a somewhat mixed status. It's both a dining room and a living room. Back then, these two functions were often blended. When people wanted to eat, a table was brought from another room and set, which is where the expression "to set the table" comes from. This room has still kept some of the original arrangements it would have had during Jean de La Fontaine's time. It has retained its large fireplace, which helped to heat this significant space. And also a tapestry, because at that time tapestries played an essential role. It was thanks to them that interiors could be kept sufficiently warm, and we are lucky here to have a tapestry that precisely depicts an Aesop's fable, that is the ancient theme that inspired Jean de La Fontaine.
Raised in a lavish environment, Jean de La Fontaine is not just a city boy.
The young La Fontaine must have had a provincial childhood, quite rural in nature, because he grew up in a small town. His education during childhood was likely less formal, certainly not as extensively or grandly provided as that received by other prominent writers of his era. He was educated by rural schoolmasters.
It's a much more rudimentary form of education. He doesn't learn Greek, but he does learn Latin, and he read the Greek authors through their Latin translations.
So he's just there, wandering around, taking his time, strolling, and he's a truant, a kid who often skips school. He lives quite well, with parents who are rather gentle with him.
His father was master of waters and forests and captain of the hunts, so that involves supervising a small administration of 15-20 people.
It involves managing the cutting of timber, the upkeep of the forest, the maintenance of the waters, of the dams, the stocking of fish, in short, all those things that are concrete, that are done right there on the ground.
So he's someone who understands nature's every detail, and we can say that through this, La Fontaine is deeply connected to the earth. In other words, he's attentive to every small detail around him.
This rural upbringing proved to be quite valuable for the future fabulist, even though initially the young boy isn't destined for a writing career.
Back then, as the family's eldest, you didn't question your future job. You took on the father's trade, inherited his duties, his noble title, if any, his income, and the house.
But this predetermined path does not seem to suit Jean de La Fontaine. As he grew into a young man, he took up residence in Paris and chose a path that was, to say the least, unexpected: the priesthood. As he turned 20, he joined the seminary of the Oratoire de Paris, located just steps from the Louvre.
It's an extremely well-known congregation. All of Paris's elite wish their children, if possible, to attend higher studies there. And young La Fontaine is part of this studious youth, eager, in short, to gain intellectual skills. The court had developed the habit of regularly attending services. Cardinal Richelieu himself would sit in one of the chapels closest to the choir. Consequently, this gathering of prominent figures naturally bestowed upon this institution a truly solemn and sumptuous character.
The oratory of the Louvre is now a Protestant temple, but the premises still bear witness to the atmosphere that reigned there in the 17th century.
At the Oratoire, they provided rigorous training with an extremely strict schedule, many studies, many prayers and meditations. And there was La Fontaine, deeply involved in all of that.
But La Fontaine very quickly plays a different game than the one he's asked to, and instead of studying theology, he says he reads a novel which is the great love story of the time, L'Astrée, by Honoré d'Urfé.
Well, that's La Fontaine in a nutshell. Inconsistent, always moving from one thing to the next, impulsively embarking on paths he simply cannot follow through on, and within those very areas, doing the complete opposite of what is expected from him.
La Fontaine, as a young boy, may not have grasped all he would have had to give up if he had taken the plunge and entered the priesthood, and that explains why he was almost booted from the Oratoire with a kick in the backside, only to leave almost a year later.
Jean de La Fontaine would frequent the circles of young poets who formed a small group known as the Knights or the Paladins of the Round Table, gathered around a very enterprising figure from Castries named Pelisson. Pelisson, who would play a very important role later at the literary court of Nicolas Fouquet.
These are individuals who are looking to build a career, many of whom have absolutely no money at all and will consequently have to find a job, and who, through the power of literature, can make a name for themselves or at least manage to get noticed.
They are students in the Latin Quarter studying serious subjects all day, but all the knowledge they accumulate during the day, they then use in the evening in their discussions to create literary games, little poems they write to mock important figures. It's quite a mischievous existence, really.
It's a very open place where people laugh and have fun. It's something open and joyful. And that's truly something Jean de La Fontaine enjoys. It matches his temperament. He even loves drinking bouts. He himself said he was under the influence of the chloris, that is to say, women of ill repute. And it's this life he loves, this somewhat bohemian life.
During his evenings at the cabaret, La Fontaine doesn't merely indulge in life's pleasures. Among his new companions, he takes his very first steps as a poet.
It's a formative period. La Fontaine produces nothing, but he writes a great deal. At the time, in a large notebook, he compiled a stock of figures, rhetorical devices, and images he planned to use in the first poems he would write.
He takes his time. I mean, really, as he says, he consumes the hours. And so, by consuming the hours, he never stops looking. That's also how it is. There are writers who work quickly, and then there are those who let their ideas slowly develop.
For La Fontaine, this incubation period is all the more prolonged because the young poet has absolutely no intention of breaking with his champagne ties.
When he finishes his law studies in Paris, La Fontaine returns to Château Thierry, and at that point must begin assisting his father in the exercise of his duties. We know, moreover, that he performs part of them, but for any bourgeois of that era who embarks on a true career, he lacks one thing: to get married.
La Fontaine was 26 when an arranged marriage united him with Marie Ericard, who was only 14. That was common practice in that era.
It's a marriage arranged by the father and then by the young girl's uncle, Jacques Janard, who is the deputy to the Attorney General at the Parliament of Paris, and therefore Nicolas Fouquet's direct assistant.
So, he gets married. He's someone who pretends not to have any will, meaning he just lets himself go. You want to? Why not? But he keeps his own will, his inner freedom, by saying yes to everyone. So, he says yes, he gets married, and she's nice. From the start, he thinks her nose is a bit long, but still, she's nice.
Marie Héricard is not, however, just a pleasant young woman. She is, above all, an excellent marriage prospect. The poet's future wife was born in La Ferté-Milon, a small medieval town a few dozen kilometers from Château-Thierry.
La Ferté-Milon is in the Valois. It's very close to Château-Thierry. We're also in a very cohesive human geography, with families who meet, marry, and are linked to each other for several generations already. Marie Héricard, we can think of her as an educated young woman. She is also a young woman with a sharp wit. We know she comes from a family of magistrates, provincial magistrates, who held local offices and grew rich from them.
By marrying Marie Héricard, Jean de La Fontaine becomes the cousin-in-law of a certain Jean Racine, also a native of La Ferté-Milon. The future playwright is still very much a young man, but the two men soon forge a truly sincere friendship. This is one of the unexpected consequences of this arranged union, made above all for financial reasons.
Marie Héricard brings a significant dowry to La Fontaine by marrying him, about 30,000 livres, a truly comfortable sum. It's a household that is particularly rich and well off for this region, with this marriage that links him to a family of magistrates from La Ferté-Milon. And with this very important dowry, La Fontaine strengthens his status as a bourgeois and a provincial notable.
But despite his good intentions, La Fontaine isn't truly cut out for that kind of life, and though this gentle dreamer conscientiously performs his duties, he appears a most unconventional husband.
La Fontaine is a consistent husband, which is extremely rare, because he is obviously extraordinarily unfaithful. He is very well married, but he has friends everywhere, young mistresses, everything you can imagine, and he finds it completely normal for his wife to do the same.
A friend of La Fontaine, who became a captain of dragoons named Poignon, was reputed to have with Madame de La Fontaine a relationship a little too close for it not to be scandalous.
In Château-Thierry, everyone is shouting, "How? It's unbelievable. It's not possible. Your wife has a lover," etc.
La Fontaine was told he needed to do something about it. Honour demanded it. La Fontaine went to find Poignon and challenged him to a duel. The other man said to him, "My poor old fellow, you can't even hold a sword. What will happen then?" He said, "I really must do it. People demand it."
He gives them 2 old rapiers, and that's it. They're off to fight a duel. So, they begin. It only lasts 2 seconds, because after just a moment, one of them yield. Then it stops right away.
La Fontaine said, "Now everything is clear." Poignant said, "You want me to stop seeing your wife?" La Fontaine replies, "Not at all. Now that honour's safe, go on."
And the two friends finally would have eventually met up later for a lunch.
That's La Fontaine all over. That is to say, freedom, no ego. He's not shocked that a man is trying to steal his wife. Not at all, that's not it. For him, everyone does as they can, as they please, and so on. He has an incredible goodwill.
Nonetheless, a child is born from this rather peculiar marriage. However, La Fontaine himself pays very little attention to this matter. As he approaches his 35th birthday, he is finally determined to try and make a name for himself as a poet. In the late 1650s, Jean de La Fontaine met Louis XIV's minister, thanks in part to his childhood friend, Paul Pélisson, who had become very influential at Fouquet's court. For the poet, this was an unparalleled chance to launch his career.
When La Fontaine meets Fouquet, he is an extremely brilliant man in every aspect. He's often spoken of as the last great prince of the Renaissance. These are people who know how to gather talents and how to encourage them.
You get the distinct impression that these two individuals, La Fontaine and Fouquet, had a real breakthrough, you see. It's a relation like the one between Montaigne and La Boétie, because it was he, because it was I.
To be sure to win over this prestigious patron, La Fontaine decided to offer him a long poem titled Adonis, where he sings of the tragic loves of the goddess Venus and a young hunter. Lavishly illuminated at Fouquet's request, the poem's manuscript is now kept at the Petit Palais in Paris.
This poem, it's kind of La Fontaine's entry ticket to Fouquet's, because he's not a poet who has a body of work behind him when he arrives at this court. So, he offers a text, not that an offering is always required. But here we have this very moving gift from the poet, a very personal gesture, visibly appreciated by Nicolas Fouquet, as he gives it such a lavish quality. It's the patron's response to the poet. It's an exceptional manuscript in every respect, because it was entrusted to exceptional artists. Nicolas Jarry for the calligraphy. Here we have Fouquet's monogram with two ends intertwined, right side up and upside down, and 4 F's surrounding them, with the crown above. Here we truly have the luxurious setting of the book. With this dedication to Fouquet, you can clearly see the name is gilded. And then this gilded frame, which is on every page, this magnificent floral band. Here, the drawing by François Chauveau, a pen and wash drawing that depicts the death of Adonis and Venus leaning over his body. So this is the poignant moment that is highlighted with a choral effect. The little cupids there are not in the poem, but graphically, they serve to echo the image of Venus's grief. Sometimes, on tender sacred grassy ground, Adonis slept beside Eurydice, who gazed upon the hero's comely form while he enjoyed a peaceful, deep repose. "Behold," said Venus, "these streams and their swift courses. Thus time can never flow back to its source. In vain for us, it flies with steps so light, but you, O mortals, must preserve its flight." La Fontaine is a poet who can paint happiness with great delicacy because he focuses on the moment when it is most fleeting, most delicate to grasp. There is always a sense of nostalgia in his work.
It is this very particular sensitivity that will ultimately captivate Nicolas Fouquet. Upon entering his service, La Fontaine could entertain the greatest hopes, for if his protector is a true patron of the arts, he is also among the wealthiest men in the entire kingdom.
So Fouquet was undoubtedly a sort of con artist. He was a man of finance, as we said earlier, that is to say, evasive.
At the time, the line between private wealth and then the state's finances was still an extremely porous one. So, he had earned a huge amount of money through government affairs.
Nicolas Fouquet's great fortune was such that in 1658, the very year he first met Jean de La Fontaine, he made the decision to acquire Belle-Île-en-Mer, a true jewel of 8,400 hectares, the largest of all the Breton islands.
Belle-Île holds a very significant strategic importance. It is highly coveted for several distinct reasons. First and foremost, it provides a natural harbor, a highly valuable anchorage point for vessels. And additionally, it boasts substantial freshwater resources. Anyone who owned Belle-Île at that time certainly held great riches, and Nicolas Fouquet's main goal was to make it even more prosperous. He planned to transform it into a vast commercial port, or even a colonial port.
For Fouquet, Belle-Île must compete with Europe's greatest ports and trade with the Indies, the West Indies, or present-day Canada. He undertakes major development projects there, also tackling the citadel, which was then just a modest military fort.
When Nicolas Fouquet's engineers arrived on Belle-Île, they decided to fortify the citadel. and to provide it with the means for its defense, a powder magazine was absolutely essential on site. It is 10 meters in diameter, and most importantly, it can hold the equivalent of 20 tons of gunpowder. If by chance a cannonball fired from outside were to cause an explosion, both the citadel and the town of Le Palais would have been razed.
This powder magazine is used to supply the cannons positioned on the citadel's ramparts. In just a few months, Belle-Île became a true stronghold.
The royal power grew concerned about the work being done by Nicolas Fouquet. He's considered particularly zealous, so emissaries were sent to Belle-Île. They sent spies, in a sense, who reported that there were a lot of men here. There are 1,500 men working on the renovation of the citadel, and they will indeed find that money is flowing freely.
Belle-Île soon became a key piece of incriminating evidence against Nicolas Fouquet. But for the moment, the superintendent is at the very height of his glory, and his new protégé is forging with him a relationship deeply marked by humor and a sharp wit. A clear symbol of this close bond is the poetic pension that the poet contractually commits to pay to the superintendent.
It's not Fouquet who pays La Fontaine a pension of money. It's La Fontaine who writes a poetic pension as if it were a currency of poetry, and in exchange, Fouquet sends him thanks in money.
La Fontaine says that he will grant him a pension, consisting of ballads, sonnets, and madrigals, but only 4 each year, and absolutely no more, because he shouldn't be asked to work too much.
Nicolas Fouquet quite naturally accepts the literary pension that La Fontaine is offering him. It's naturally something he considers to be an amusement.
In his dealings with his patron, he doesn't hesitate to display this somewhat nonchalant, rather lazy casualness, to also avoid falling into the caricature of the servile poet who absolutely wants to please at any cost.
At Fouquet's court, La Fontaine honed his craft, and over the months acquired that playful, light-hearted touch he'd never lose. But his position also made him a key witness to his patron's extraordinary political ambition.
Nicolas Fouquet wanted to become prime minister upon Mazarin's death in March 1661. That was his primary ambition. But Louis XIV said he would no longer have a prime minister.
Back then, Louis XIV seemed like a somewhat charming bystander who was only interested in dance, music, and ballet. People thought he wouldn't last 6 months without asking for a prime minister to help him govern. So Fouquet believed he had a good chance of becoming the new ruler of France.
But Louis XIV doesn't see it that way, and all the more so, because in the shadows, the formidable Colbert is orchestrating things.
He is appointed as the financial superintendent, placing him directly below Fouquet. Therefore, he oversees all the accounts.
Louis XIV knew nothing of finance, but Colbert did. Colbert told him, Fouquet is deceiving you. Here's why he lied to you. And Colbert proved to him beyond a doubt that Fouquet was making a fool of him. Louis XIV didn't like to be made a fool of.
Unaware of the storm ahead, in the summer of 1661, Nicolas Fouquet hosts an extraordinary party here at Vaux-le-Vicomte to impress the king. Jean de La Fontaine is, naturally, present. He doesn't imagine for a moment that his patron is living his last moments of freedom.
On August 17th in the afternoon, the king arrives from Fontainebleau with his bodyguards, his musketeers, a portion of the court, 600 people in all, and the king will then proceed through the chateau, heading directly into the gardens. The king has no garden apart from a small plot of land at the Tuileries. There is nothing, and here it is pure magnificence. He gazed upon it. He remained there for a long time, pensive.
The court of Louis XIV, along with his friend Nicolas Fouquet, strolled through a garden where the garden was an integral part of the show. All the fountains were in full operation. The act of arriving at the Grand Canal on foot from the castle, a Grand Canal which is absolutely invisible from the castle, and then suddenly discovering this immense body of water is truly one of the most extraordinary surprises. And that's what truly left a lasting impression on everyone.
All the senses were enchanted, and the banquet offered beauties worthy of a god, worthy of the master, and worthy of their majesties. Never will Vaux-le-Vicomte be more splendid than it was that night.
La Fontaine himself was amazed by the celebration, even though he knew the place. He was a man who advocated, I'd say, for beauty, harmony, etc. He got caught up in it and describes it in such a way that you really get the impression he was like a child, who was given all these surprises, one after another.
One of La Fontaine's preferred spots is located between the Grand Canal and the Chateau, at what are known as the water gates. For in the 17th century, it was said that 41 water jets adorned this alley. On August 17th, 1661, a comedy ballet titled Les Fâcheux was performed there. It is the work of a certain Molière.
La Fontaine describes, in a rather precise way, the special effect that punctuated the play with quite extraordinary surprises, where we actually have man-sized shells that open and from which a character emerges, and trees that move on stage, also making way for other characters. And then arrives the evening's last surprise. Nicolas Fouquet's guests head to the Grand Canal. And on the Grand Canal, believe it or not, a whale appeared, from which many fireworks and rockets were launched. So it's joy, excitement at its peak for Nicolas Fouquet's guests, who then returned to the chateau. And then, a spectacular fireworks display is launched from the castle's dome, specifically from the very highest point of the castle's roof. This fireworks show catched all the guests completely by surprise, to such an extent that some horses were frightened by these loud rocket blasts and fell into the castle's moat.
These horses that once pulled a magnificent carriage now pull the boat of Charon, for they fell into the moat of Vaux-le-Vicomte.
Fouquet's arrest was like a sudden, unexpected bolt out of the blue.
Imagine the shock for this poet who had finally managed to get his start when this man who had organized his rise to fame, who had drawn him into his own inner circle, finds himself imprisoned by Louis XIV and ultimately treated like a renegade against the kingdom.
We have a letter from La Fontaine, which in a few lines describes the event without commenting, saying that he doesn't know what he should do.
La Fontaine is moved and quite astonished. He is especially touched by this because he had a profound admiration and a very real friendship for this superintendent.
When La Fontaine learns the news, it's already been a few days since his patron was imprisoned. It was in Nantes, at the castle of the Dukes of Brittany, that Nicolas Fouquet's fate abruptly changed on September 5th, 1661, on Louis XIV's birthday.
Nicolas Fouquet is in Nantes at the time of the meeting of the estates of the province of Brittany. He is therefore accompanying the king on this significant journey into the province, since the king, through this very act, meets the Bretons for the very first time since his ascension to the throne. Fouquet has no reason to be wary of this trip, since as the superintendent of finance, it is within the prerogative and responsibilities of his office to follow the king in a matter that is primarily financial and fiscal. The day of September 5th, 761, first begins with a rather early council, it is said, to allow the king to then devote himself to hunting, since it is obviously one of his favourite activities. The only slightly unusual circumstance is that when the king's ministers are taking their leave, Louis XI detains Fouquet for a moment, for a few minutes as it happens.
This private meeting was the very last between the two men. In the courtyard, D'Artagnan, a king's musketeer sub-lieutenant, is ready to intervene. But things won't go as planned.
Nicolas Fouquet descends the staircase. He is surrounded by a multitude of petitioners, clients, friends, and allies. There is a moment of uncertainty as D'Artagnan loses sight of Nicolas Fouquet for a few minutes, and it is near the cathedral, on Saint-Pierre Square, that Nicolas Fouquet was arrested. D'Artagnan informs him of his arrest in the name of the king.
In the weeks that followed, Fouquet's closest associates were in danger. Paul Pélisson himself was imprisoned. La Fontaine explains that the king is deeply mad against Fouquet and his close ones.
This is extremely dangerous for him. What kind of fate now befalls him? Is he to be dragged into public disgrace? This is something truly catastrophic for him.
In this particularly troubled period, La Fontaine shows unwavering loyalty to his former protector. He even courageously decides to commit to Fouquet's defense, and as a sign of respect, he has his texts sent to him in prison before having them published.
We are on the first floor of the Vincennes Keep, and it was in this very spot that Nicolas Fouquet was imprisoned from January 1st, 1662, until June 20th, 1663, so for almost a year and a half. Well, as you can clearly see, it's a very vast space, but it doesn't stand alone. There are 3 separate outbuildings located in the turrets. One of them was used as a chapel, the other was allocated for servants' quarters, and the third one was the doctor's quarters. Therefore, it is most probable that it was through the assistance of these attorneys that Fouquet first read the Ode au Roi. This is a formal appeal presented to the king, requesting his royal clemency and the full forgiveness which he ought to grant to Nicolas Fouquet. The objective here is to rally the literary Parnassus, that group of writers who had gathered themselves around Nicolas Fouquet. Therefore, this is a direct appeal from Jean de La Fontaine to all the individuals who had previously surrounded Fouquet, and who, for many months already, have become noticeably silent.
From the depths of his cell, the disgraced minister replies to the poet that it is probably useless to beg the king. But La Fontaine does not give in, and publishes his text as it was written, and this would not be his only work in favor of Fouquet.
Among them is the fable of the fox and the squirrel. We know that the squirrel was Fouquet's coat of arms, because the name Fouquet means squirrel in Old French. And this fable, The Fox and the Squirrel, recounts the tale of a squirrel who is battered by a storm, a tempest that blows with great intensity and terrible force, and a fox at the foot of the tree begins to mock him. But the squirrel, upon seeing hunters approaching from a distance, says to the fox, "One must never make fun of those who are experiencing suffering." This is a fable that quite evidently echoes the current quarrel, the prevailing situation. We can therefore surmise that the very idea of writing fables originated from the downfall of Fouquet.
If this matter gave La Fontaine a taste for fables, it also resulted in him traveling the roads of France in the summer of 1663.
He's accompanying his uncle, or rather, his wife's uncle, Janard, who has truly committed himself to Fouquet's defence from a legal standpoint, and who is also Fouquet's wife's lawyer. Janard is therefore somewhat sidelined. Let's just say he's dismissed, so he goes to Limoges, and La Fontaine follows him, perhaps because he's sickened by what he sees in Paris, perhaps also because, as was his custom, just like his entry into the oratory, or his entry into the fables, or indeed throughout his entire life, he simply throws himself into whatever presents itself.
That was the only journey he ever takes in his entire life. How could a person like him have traveled so very little? I mean, someone who only ever made one single trip in his whole life, that was to Limousin. And the rest of his travels were just Château-Thierry, Paris, Paris, Château-Thierry.
La Fontaine and Janard left Paris on August 23, 1763, and only reached Limoges almost 3 weeks later.
For La Fontaine, it's an opportunity to discover the Loire Valley, which he likes very much, to visit Blois, Amboise, to see some family in Châtellerault, and to discover many beautiful works stored in the castles, statues, paintings, notably by great Italian Renaissance artists who undoubtedly reinforced his fascination for Italy, which he never visited.
The journey to Limousin is known to us through a series of letters, including the 2 poems and prose La Fontaine addressed to his wife. These letters are the kind of semi-public, semi-private things, which means you still work on your letters just in case they're read aloud in a salon one day. And that's probably why they were written.
Only 2 of the 6 original letters have managed to survive the passage of the centuries. These documents are carefully preserved at the National Library of France, and they constitute some of the rare documents written by La Fontaine himself. As we look through these pages, characterized by such meticulous handwriting, we are able to learn a little bit more about the true personality of the poet.
He is curious about his travel companions. He sketches a portrait of the people who are with them in the car. It reveals to him people who live far from power and who live happily. He's quite critical. He'll easily say a town is dirty or uninteresting, poorly paved, and so on. But what always makes it all worthwhile is that there are pretty girls, and he always manages to find them. In Châtellerault, he's staying with a cousin. He's presented with a whole string of children. He says he can't recall all these children. There are too many. But he was also shown the eldest girl, and this was a young girl, so right away, he's more interested. This young girl, unfortunately, had smallpox, so her face was scarred. And so he writes a short poem about this young girl who, despite her facial marks, is still very pretty. So he speaks to the illness and tells it. You haven't destroyed everything. Her mouth, eyes, features, and other beautiful things are proof. You leave her with lilies since you took her roses. And since she is a distant relative of mine, one might think I would have taken great pleasure in telling her so.
These letters are a bit disconcerting. La Fontaine, while writing to his wife, enjoys the image of a seducer he projects, an image his wife was clearly aware of. But at the same time, he's a thoughtful husband who explains he goes to bed very late, even though he loves to sleep, to tell his wife the wonders of the Loire Valley castles. So, a rather contradictory image, which seems to indicate at least a relatively good understanding between the couple.
Upon his return from his travels, La Fontaine must resign himself to drawing a line under his Fouquet years. From now on, there is only one great patron, Louis XIV, and artists have a simple mission, to celebrate his glory.
Louis XIV asked a particularly docile and dull academician named Chaplin, a failed poet, to draw up the list of writers and poets who were to receive a grant.
One must understand that the celebrated figures of France were granted pensions, not according to their individual talent, but rather based on the specific genre in which they chose to work. We observe, for instance, that Corneille received a much more substantial endowment than Molière. Why was this the case? Because tragedy was considered superior to comedy.
The Sun King showed no resentment towards Nicolas Fouquet's former protégé. Besides Molière, many artists from Vaux-le-Vicomte joined Louis XIV's entourage. But La Fontaine would never receive even the smallest royal pension.
La Fontaine writes in genres that no one would have ever imagined. We don't know if he's extremely Christian or a libertine, let's say. In short, he is simply too unreliable.
La Fontaine's style simply doesn't suit Louis XIV. He isn't able to flatter him sufficiently. Louis XIV loves pomp, splendour and grandeur, and La Fontaine finds much more pleasure in an imaginary world, that of the pastoral, a world of intimacy, of gentleness and of nostalgia, which ultimately strikes a discordant note at Versailles.
And despite the poet's best efforts, the situation did not truly improve as time went on. Just a few years later, at Versailles, the king decided nonetheless to put the fables on display in a vast labyrinth situated within what is now the Queen's Grove. But he chose to do so without La Fontaine's involvement.
There's a growing movement in favor of fables, People are showing interest in Aesop in antiquity, and so the labyrinth fits perfectly into this logic. The entrance to the labyrinth grove was in the northeast corner of the plot. So we walked past the 39 fountains that punctuated the paths. None went straight. Everything was at an angle, with the possibility of getting lost. But we went from fountain to fountain, much to the delight of the mind. The labyrinth motif in gardens is not original. We find it in the Renaissance and even in modern times. However, illustrating it with fables is quite original, as we combine the visitor's wandering, which is hazardous, with discovery and an initiatory discourse linked to the fables.
The labyrinth grove then featured almost 330 carved animals. Today, about 30 of them are kept at the small stable, one of the castle's sculpture reserves, exceptionally open to the public.
These are elements from a fountain, so they were cast in lead and then painted. They are polychrome lead pieces, and many of them have retained clear traces of this original polychromy. One must envision a very colorful, highly vibrant arrangement. Given that the animals were meant to speak, their words expressed by the jets of water that came out of their muzzles or mouths. Aesop had his statue at the entrance of the grove. He is small, he is deformed, he is hunchbacked. And he holds in his left hand a scroll, on which is inscribed in Greek the title of the Fables by Aesop.
The ancient fabulist's figure is truly at the heart of this vast project, and when Louis XIV seeks authors to illustrate his lead fables, he carefully avoids La Fontaine.
The king called upon Charles Perrault to choose the fables, as well as Isaac de Benserade, who illustrated them with quatrains whose texts were placed next to the fountains or on the fountains in the grove itself. Given that La Fontaine is the greatest author of fables at that time, his absence at Versailles could not go unnoticed. And this grove of the labyrinth testifies to its relative seclusion from the court's world.
On July 14, 1664, at the Luxembourg Palace, La Fontaine took an oath before the Duchess of Orléans, widow of Louis XIII's brother. The poet then becomes one of his gentleman servants.
La Fontaine becomes, in a way, a kind of luxury servant at that time. When you are a gentleman's servant, you can take on all sorts of duties, ultimately quite basic for the person you serve, but which are hardly demanding.
The gentleman servant would taste some of the dishes. He would go to the sideboard and bring others. In short, it was a table service function.
It's not very restrictive. There's a small remuneration, but the advantage is he becomes a nobleman. He is noble.
However, you are there to entertain the person you serve with your conversation, which we hope is as brilliant as possible, and Jean de La Fontaine then perfectly fits the bill.
The framework for these new responsibilities is quite grand. The Luxembourg Palace. Marie de Médicis' old castle still remains one of the capital's most beautiful residences. The Golden Book Room is a reconstructed setting from the early 17th century. It gives an idea of the setting in which the poet then evolves.
After seeing Vaux, perhaps the Orléans Palace seemed a bit old-fashioned to him, with a somewhat more traditional style. Vaux was the new art. It was, after all, the future creators of Versailles. The Luxembourg Palace, it was still of the Louis XIII style, but one cannot imagine that he remained unmoved by the ceilings, the gilding, the carpets, the furniture, by all the beauty and opulence that surrounded him, at least within the palace's grand reception rooms.
But within the establishment, the mood is not festive. The Duchess is in deep mourning. She has just lost her husband, Gaston d'Orléans.
She is a woman who has known great sorrow, having first lost her husband and then later her daughter. And so La Fontaine enters a deeply saddened court, and she becomes very devout at that moment.
The Dowager Duchess of Orléans is finally someone who runs a house that is a little bit dying.
To this, we must add an atmosphere of trench warfare, because the Duchess is condemned to cohabit with her stepdaughter, the Grande Mademoiselle, and between them, neighborly conflicts can escalate significantly.
The Grande Mademoiselle was a virago, a girl with a bad temper. And when it came to living together with the Dowager Duchess, who was entirely steeped in devotion, and what's more, a second wife, things went very badly between the two ladies. The palace was then divided in two, and to firmly ensure this separation, the great Mademoiselle had a barricade erected between the two parts of the estate. For her part, the Duchess, to get revenge, had a magnificent row of trees cut down that enhanced the view from Mademoiselle's apartments. That's how they got along in Luxembourg, and how all that happened.
La Fontaine is bored to death at the Luxembourg, but fortunately, his duties are not too demanding. He is not often at the palace and has the necessary time to compose.
So, at that moment, there was a real intensification of his productivity, which is undoubtedly explainable by the fact that he had truly found his genius. He had discovered himself after the trials and errors allowed to him during Fouquet's time, and before that, something had finally taken hold. It can be said that the Luxembourg Palace was the very place where his genius truly crystallized, and from that point, the wellspring was tapped, and the water never ceased to flow.
This genius, La Fontaine doesn't initially dedicate it to the writing of fables. He ventures into a completely opposite genre, publishing bawdy tales inspired by Renaissance authors.
These tales, they are stories that are imitated from Ariosto, from Tasso, from Italian poets, little spirited stories that tell acts of love, gallant deeds, but in a language and in circumstances that do not seek to present them in their most romantic light.
The subjects that he chooses are the cuckolded husbands, the wives who deceive their spouses, the men who pursue attractive young women, and the debauched monks.
There are amazing tales, like that of the spectacles. You must read the tales of the spectacles.
Jean de La Fontaine tells how a young man manages to get into a convent by concealing his anatomy to appear as a woman. And then the secret is discovered when one of the nuns becomes pregnant.
The mother abbess thought it might be a rogue disguised as a nun living among them. So she decided everyone should strip naked immediately to see if there was a boy or not.
Obviously, all this excites the young man, and the irreparable happens. As the prioress's gaze is fixed on him, his penis flew with mighty flounce, as when a fiery steed disdains to bear the yoke and scorns the ranches. When once got loose, upright it rove and struck the abbess on the nose.
Fairy tales embody that particular stance. They possess a great deal of depth, a lot of coarseness, but are kept at a distance through elegance, two contrasts that amount to a sophisticated refinement.
So, all of Paris's high society, even those not necessarily the most libertine, greatly enjoy all these tales, which are always full of wit and spice, and as such are a literary achievement.
Despite not having the king's protection, La Fontaine became, thanks to his captivating stories, the darling of Parisian salons.
These salons are social circles, part friendly, part high society, where people gather a little on the fringes of the court.
Salons played a significant role in spreading works back then. One's work was read in a salon before it was even printed.
These are circles where women play a decisive role. They are the ones who, in a sense, act as moderators in the discussions that take place in their salons. They are the ones who, to some extent, give others a chance to speak. They are the ones who select the speakers. It's as much about intellectual curiosity as it is about the desire to be entertained.
One can't exist if they're not in salons, since salons hold intellectual power.
These literary circles would gather in the grand residences of the Marais district in Paris. Most of these grand homes have since disappeared. However, the Carnavalet Museum has meticulously recreated one of the most sophisticated interiors from that period.
We are in the Abbé de la Riviere's gilded study in his mansion. The abbé, a prominent figure, a minister of state, naturally settled in the elegant district of the time, in the Marais and on the Place Royale. The decor of this cabinet was exceptionally rich, to the point where it was said that gold seemed to have been poured in by the ingot. If this is one of the rare examples of such decor still existing in the Marais, it's important to remember that back then, most grand houses had similar interiors of comparable splendor.
His stories had brought him great success, but his fables would bring him triumph. The salons reacted immediately, you know. They admired him just as quickly. Madame de Sévigné played a significant part in the affair.
The famous letter writer, received in Paris's most influential salons, adores fables.
Madame de Sévigné says she learns these fables for her leisure. She says, "I learned them the other day with the Duke of La Rochefoucauld. We imagined them by the fire." She tells her eldest daughter that she should do the same.
For her, La Fontaine's central talent, his primary and innate talent, is to make fables. She speaks of him. She says he makes fables like an apple tree makes apples.
La Fontaine knew how to express his gratitude. He would thus dedicate a fable to the Marquise's daughter, renowned for her great beauty, the lion in love.
Sévigné, de qui les attraits servent aux grâces de modèle et qui n'acquitte toute belle à votre indifférence près, pourriez-vous être favorable aux jeux innocents d'une fable et voir sans vous épouvanter un lion qu'amour sut dompter? Amour est un étrange maître, heureux qui peut ne le connaître que par récit, lui ni ses coups. Quand on en parle devant vous, si la vérité vous offense, la fable au moins se peut souffrir. Celle-ci prend bien l'assurance de venir à vos pieds s'offrir. Par zèle, par reconnaissance. Du temps que les bêtes parlaient, les lions, entre autres, voulaient être admis dans notre alliance. Pourquoi non? Puisque leur engeance valait la nôtre en ce temps-là, ayant courage, intelligence et bellure. Outre cela, voici comment il en alla. Un lion de haut parentage, en passant par un certain pré, rencontra bergère, à son gré. Il la demande en mariage. Le père aurait fort souhaité quelque gendre un peu moins terrible. La donner lui semblait bien dure, la refuser n'était pas sûr. Même un refus fait possible qu'on eût vu quelques beaux matins un mariage clandestin. Car outre qu'en toute manière la fille était pour les gens fiers, fille se coiffe volontiers d'amoureux à longue crinière. Le père donc ouvertement, n'osant renvoyer son amant, lui dit: ma fille est délicate, vos griffes la pourront blesser quand vous voudrez la caresser. Permettez donc qu'à chaque patte on vous les rogne, et pour les dents qu'on vous les lime en même temps. Vos baisers en seront moins rudes et pour vous plus délicieux, car ma fille répondra mieux, étant sans ses inquiétudes. Le lion consent à cela, tant son âme était aveuglée, sans dents ni griffes, le voilà, comme place démantelée. On lâcha sur lui quelques chiens. Il fit très peu de résistance. Amour. Amour. Quand tu nous tiens, on peut bien dire adieu, prudence. Là, c'est...
Despite his great success, La Fontaine would never truly make a fortune. At that time, authors' rights simply did not exist. The poet therefore kept the position of master of waters and forests, which he had inherited from his father. This provided him with a comfortable income. He regularly travels to Chateau Thierry to hold court, but also to write in this room of his birthplace, considered to be his office.
It's thought La Fontaine may have composed some works here, retiring to Chateau Thierry for peace, in addition to the literary pieces he wrote in a more bustling Paris among his friends and patrons. Chateau Thierry, one feels that it's the ultimate refuge for this poet, who undoubtedly also needs some quietude. He is someone who does not align himself with any particular coterie. He's perhaps someone who doesn't always tolerate the city's atmosphere and needs to find himself in a somewhat peaceful retreat.
However, La Fontaine very soon is compelled to sell off all his possessions, his lands, his official position, and ultimately, his own house. More like the carefree grasshopper than the diligent ant, the poet finds himself completely riddled with debt.
We don't really know how he spends his money, but he spends it freely, probably on gambling, in cabarets, and no doubt also with women. There is even separation of property with Marie Héricard, his wife. In any case, this prevents her from being dragged into La Fontaine's financial downfall. We don't quite know how money flows, but it slips through his fingers.
La Fontaine even verges on destitution in 1672, when the Duchess of Orléans passes away. He then loses the only income he had left, his small pension as a gentleman-in-waiting.
It was the day his life completely fell apart, when he had nothing left, when he ran out of money, that he became fully Parisian, and in the most unexpected way for him, as a bohemian poet.
From that moment on, La Fontaine's existence was hanging by a thread, that of the generosity of wealthy benefactors he needed to secure.
She really became friends with Jean de La Fontaine.
I believe she was the woman who loved him the most.
So, we don't know how far La Fontaine might have wished to go, but nevertheless, a true friendship began between these two people.
She provided him with a home for 2 decades, and even when she moved out, but she brought her dog, her cat, and La Fontaine along with her. She never would have left without him.
Marguerite de la Sablière is truly a free woman. Separated from her husband, she lives exactly as she wishes, surrounded by the greatest minds of her time.
Madame de la Sablière, known as Iris, her salon name, is a woman who is at the very heart of a network, a brilliant social circle.
She hosts a salon where are discussed all the great debates of the time, themes like science, sometimes also occult matters, and literature.
It's a sort of fertile ground where he can have an opportunity to think, to meet. We know that, for example, he borrowed fables from travellers who were returning, from Siberia or Canada, etc., who told stories about the animals from there, and that he transformed that into fables.
Under the patronage of Madame de la Sablière, La Fontaine would then publish 2 brand new collections of fables. But their success, and also that of his stories, no longer was enough for him.
La Fontaine is not an arrogant man, but he is a man in search of recognition. And even though he knows he touches the sublime and has achieved perfection in his fables and his tales, he is still someone who always seeks to rise to the higher rank of poet. And we feel that, like all authors of the 17th century, he dreams of distinguishing himself in noble genres like Racine, like Boileau.
He spends many months working on an opera libretto, for which Lully, official musician of Louis XIV, was to compose the music, but the master ultimately refused to do so.
Lully has a nasty temper. Anyway, it never works out with Lully. Molière tried, Boileau and Racine tried, and the text published by La Fontaine is quite bad.
La Fontaine deeply resents being betrayed by Lully. He therefore writes an extremely harsh satire against the one he calls the Florentine. Lully is, in fact, from Florence.
It's a poem of rare malice from La Fontaine, which even ends with an invocation to God saying, "Lord, you who led the people out of Egypt, you who delivered them from all the world's plagues, rid us of the Florentine." And the two men, Lully and Jean de La Fontaine, remained estranged for a long time.
Yet, this failure does not discourage the poet, who will also try his luck in the theater. The National Library of France thus preserves the only literary manuscript by Jean de La Fontaine that was not destroyed. A draft of a tragedy, Achilles, that was discovered among the papers of one of his friends.
If it was preserved, it's because it's extremely bad, extremely disappointing. So it's quite paradoxical. We have an immense writer whose worst verses were the only ones kept. Whereas normally these verses flow with extreme fluidity, this is poetry that's very difficult to compose. He spends a lot of time, there are numerous deletions, many second thoughts. And when we examine this manuscript, we notice that in certain spots he attaches a slip of paper, a small piece of paper. He completely crossed out a whole series of verses and pasted a slightly cleaner version over them. And what's very curious is that it's a manuscript that stops very abruptly. It ends after 14 pages. We have a line from Liddy, and here Patroclus is supposed to give the answer. "I promise to conquer after this fury." Already, conquer after, that's not an extraordinary construction. It's probably the moment he thought, "I'm fed up, I can't do it." So really, it's work that stops, due to lack of inspiration, probably.
Desirous of official recognition, the fabulist, now well over 60 years of age, harbors another dream, that of becoming an academician.
In Jean de La Fontaine's time, the Académie Française was still a young institution. It was founded by Richelieu as a society of renowned men of letters chosen for their talents to standardize the use of the language.
40 members who elect their own successors upon the passing of one of their number. By 1683, La Fontaine had become the undisputed master of a literary genre that he himself had invented. He then had the audacity to present himself as a candidate for the seat left vacant by the death of Colbert. However, there was a problem.
When Jean de La Fontaine applied to the Académie Française, he was known for his somewhat risque tales, so victory wasn't assured from the start.
The academicians quarrelled, they exchanged insults, and then they eventually read them. And when the election was presented to Louis XIV, who was the Academy's protector, Louis XIV said they needed to wait a little for things to calm down.
A few months later, a new seat became available. After securing the election of Boileau, his historiographer, Louis XIV, then consented to re-examine La Fontaine's case.
Louis XIV validated the election by saying, "La Fontaine has promised to be wise."
Finally, the official recognition. On May 2nd, 1684, the poet was admitted to the Academy at the age of 63. The palace, with its famous dome designed by Laveau, did not yet house the institution. Only since the 19th century has the reception ceremony been held here.
The locations have changed, but the ritual remains the same. You must be elected, received, and so on. It's precisely the same, and this permanence has been for nearly 4 centuries. La Fontaine has no family, La Fontaine has no money, La Fontaine is all alone, so the Academy will be his first real family, deep down.
But before being accepted into this new family, he must still undergo a delicate exercise.
During his speech, where he praises his predecessor, Colbert, he has to swallow insults, since he speaks well of his enemy with delight. And most importantly, He promises to write no more stories.
And then he was received by the abbot of the chamber, who gave him a stern lecture telling him, "Forget everything you have written, and from this moment on what truly counts is to sing the praises of the king."
With his election to the Académie Française, La Fontaine truly became one of the century's great men. It's an official recognition that no one can ever take away from him. And what's more, La Fontaine is extremely diligent at the Academy's meetings, even if he dozes off, a consequence of his advanced age.
During this period, the poet became closely associated with prominent libertine princes. For instance, Louis Joseph de Vendôme. Known as the Great Vendôme, he was one of the most important generals serving Louis XIV, and he notably distinguished himself during the War of the Spanish Succession.
The great captain was also quite a colourful character, known for his peculiar habits and also for his outspokenness and his manner of receiving people. It's said he would receive visitors while sitting on his chamber pot.
Between his military campaigns, the great Vendôme would often retreat to his magnificent chateau in Anet, situated about 100 kilometers from Paris. This splendid Renaissance-style chateau had been gifted in the preceding century by Henry II to Diane de Poitiers. By settling in, Vendôme brought it up to date, giving it a modern feel.
He makes the conscious decision to transform this residence, I would venture to say, into a rather contemporary dwelling, imbuing it with ample illumination, indeed, a veritable flood of light. Consequently, he commissions this truly magnificent staircase, which stands as a testament to architectural prowess, but which, quite remarkably, occupies nearly a full third of the entire house. And then he proceeds to create these truly magnificent, large Roman-style halberdiers, which are meticulously sculpted from enormous, gigantic wooden logs. And so, who genuinely creates a work of art right there inside the house?
This truly impressive monumental staircase leads directly to the main guardroom. This is where Vendôme would entertain all of Paris.
He would throw grand parties. But this was not at all to the king's liking, who found the Vendôme festivities to be rather too debauched. There was a lot of food and a lot of drink. It's even said there were some drugs. It must have been opium. And many gentlemen, because he was homosexual, and so he had a court made up of quite a few men. And people at the court mostly chose to look away. For the rest of the time, he fought on the battlefields in a very glorious manner. So they let these debaucheries and their grand nocturnal parties pass.
It's interesting to consider La Fontaine, at that point, finding a second youth, even as he presents himself as an old man among all these young people, and praising characters for whom he couldn't have had much esteem. There, one gets the impression that the poet is somewhat selling his pen. I'd almost say he's prostituting it, but then again, his occasional poetry isn't his best work.
La Fontaine thus composed numerous court poems until the day he fell gravely ill. Perceiving death's approach, he abruptly turned to religion and decided to convert.
At the end of their lives, in the 17th century, ordinary people underwent a conversion. Conversion doesn't mean changing religion, but turning to God, knowing you'll meet Him, and preparing for the encounter. That's how it generally works.
The one tasked with receiving Jean de La Fontaine's conversion is Abbot Puget. And for Abbot Puget, it's quite a challenge to obtain the conversion of a man as notoriously debauched as Jean de La Fontaine.
He's going to be absolutely forced to make his public confession, just like in those major political trials, his public confession. He's already ill, in his bed, in his room, and he receives all his fellow academics, and he confesses he's ashamed of all these stories, which are rubbish, and that he wishes to be carried through Paris, and for everyone to show him their contempt. So finally, it's in front of everyone like this, and everyone cries, great sentimentality, and so on.
La Fontaine would ultimately pass away 2 years later, at the age of 73, quite alone in his small room. But while the poet himself may have faded, his truly unique body of work achieved an incredible and lasting legacy.
Upon his death, there was a truly significant public fascination. The fable proved to be immensely popular with the Regency and throughout the reign of Louis XV.
In the 19th century, La Fontaine became a cornerstone of French school education. It was then that a wealth of popular items began to be produced, such as the Epinal prints and mass-produced editions like those by Gustave Doré or Jean-Jacques Granville.
La Fontaine, a true national glory, is also celebrated all around the world. His fables are illustrated in India, in China, or even in Japan. And this remarkable success would never diminish. At the very beginning of the last century, an influential art dealer, Ambroise Vollard, consequently reached out to a talented young Russian painter, Marc Chagall. He then assigned him the significant task of illustrating a collection of 100 fables. Today, some of these gouaches are preserved in this Parisian art gallery.
So here we have 4 fables by La Fontaine, beautifully illustrated by Chagall. So we have the fable of the fox and the stork, the 2 pigeons, Death and the woodcutter, and finally the fox and the grapes. For Ambroise Vollard, La Fontaine was too often categorized as merely an animal painter or simply a somewhat bourgeois moralist, and he, for his part, felt that it actually went far beyond that, and for him, the ideal solution was to enlist the help of a painter, but specifically a painter who possessed a vivid imagination, a truly creative mind, and above all, a remarkable gift for the invention of colors, and that was Chagall. Some people thought Vollard was a little crazy for entrusting the illustration of Jean de La Fontaine's Fables, one of France's most iconic poets, to a Russian painter. But ultimately, Chagall possessed this magic that made the animals perform so wonderfully. The color truly jumps out at you. Even though we have a fable that already speaks of death, there's still an intense blue and pigeons kissing under the moonlight. There's this enchanting, this dreamy side to it. He successfully managed to remove the entire moralizing aspect that was inherent in the fable itself. He gave it a much vaster, a much more artistic, and a more dreamlike dimension.
In nearly 40 years of his career, La Fontaine succeeded in producing a body of work that is much more complex than it initially appears. At once light and profound, deceptively naive, and always piquant, it stands as one of the most original and enduring contributions to French literature.
Alors donner ça aux enfants, pourquoi pas? Je n'ai pas d'opinion, mais pour moi, ça n'est pas du tout un auteur pour enfants. Pas du tout. Faut commencer La Fontaine à 17 ans, quoi. 16-17 ans.